Who caused the 1929 crisis? This is Libertarian View, your source of decentralized and distributed information with a libertarian bias. The free market isn't sustainable because, from time to time, there are crises that destroy the economy, causing the market to collapse. Only government intervention can prevent or ameliorate such crises, and only the government is able to get us out of them. How many times have you been told that capitalism is dead? I bet the last time was in the 2008 crisis, which still haunts us to this day. Before that, there was the 2003 crisis, when capitalism was also declared dead with Iran's bankruptcy. Even before that, there was the Russian crisis that killed capitalism in 1998. There were the crises from 1992, 1987, and so on. It's funny how governments, even with all the mechanisms to prevent crises, were absolutely unable to prevent them. The thing is, this unsustainable capitalism is a crony capitalism, a system in which the government and some of its company friends sleep in the same bed. This quote-unquote capitalism, that is very popular in Brazil, is much closer to the communist economic system from the Soviet Union and Cuba than to the actual free market model. The best way to understand this is to study an iconic case. Probably the most studied economic crisis ever, the 1929 crisis. Who caused the 1929 crisis? How did we manage to get out of it? And what can we learn from it? The 1929 crisis, also known as the Great Depression, was a big economic crisis that originated in the United States of America, affecting markets all around the world. Up until that point, everything was going well, and the United States had had some pretty prosperous times in the 20s. However, on October 24th, a Tuesday that went down in history as Black Tuesday, the shares from the New York stock market started to plummet drastically. At that moment, no one really understood what was happening since the means of communication were still quite rudimental. So that led people to the stock market in order to get information about what was happening. Crowds of people went to the streets of New York. Those people saw their money evaporate with the fall from the stocks. This collapse went on for days, bringing a lot of companies to bankruptcy. Many cases of suicide were registered, and people started selling their properties for incredibly low prices. And just to top it off, the unemployment rates reached unprecedented levels in the country. The 1929 crisis wasn't the first economic crisis, and most certainly also not the last one of them. It was neither the worst one nor the longest one, but this crisis had a special aspect to it because it happened in the economically most liberal country in the world at the time, and managed to convince Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt to make changes in their economic policies. Up until this crisis, the American government had laissez-faire policies, also known as classical liberalism. So the market wasn't regulated and received no help from the government. Should there be a crisis in the market, that would be the market's business to solve. Of course, there had been crises before 1929, but this one made the government take another look at its strategy, introduce a lot of regulations, and execute a set of specific actions with the goal of solving the crisis problem. This plan was called the New Deal. Since the most liberal country in the world introduced these ideas, people began to believe that the free market was done for. Classical liberalism was blamed for the crisis, and the economic conduction of the country was kidnapped by the government. If you went to high school in Brazil, I don't even need to give you too many details on this version of the narrative. Here, people believe that the free, unregulated market model was the cause of the crisis. And then came Keynes, the super economist who saved everyone with his recommendations of the government incurring in debt and injecting money into the economy. But let's understand this step by step first. First of all, what is an economic crisis? A crisis is something similar to what Brazil has been going through since 2015. There is a factor of uncertainty in the markets that worries people. In Brazil's case, it was the factor of Dilma's capability, or lack thereof, of running the economy, which worried people a lot. These worried people prefer to save money and won't buy as much as they would otherwise. If no one is buying anything, business starts to slow down. Companies go bankrupt and start firing people. If companies are going bankrupt and the unemployment rate is going up, people become even more worried and consume even less. This creates a feedback loop that is responsible for worsening the crisis. But what is Keynes' explanation for this? Keynes was a British socialist economist who created the underconsumption theory. He believed that the free market was unsustainable because there was a natural tendency for the consumption rates to be lower than the supply rate, which would always amount to a production surplus. The logic is simple. It would be impossible for the consumption rate to be larger than the supply, but it could theoretically be lower. Since both of these factors vary within time, the tendency would be that leftover goods, which were produced but not consumed, would accumulate. For instance, if 10 cars are produced, but 11 people want a car, someone from that group won't get a car. However, if 11 cars are produced and only 10 people want a car, the leftover car is considered a surplus of production. The long-term expectation would be that the loss caused by the surplus is accumulated over time. At some given moment, the companies would start getting worried about the excess of goods in the market and stop producing. This would set up the chain reaction that would lead to the crisis. Keynes and other economists from his time suggested that in order to keep the situation under control, the government should always inject money into the economy. That's right, just turn on the printer and make some more money out of nowhere. This would create positive inflation that would counterbalance the underconsumption effect. Keynes also had a great solution to get out of the crisis. Simply use the same medicine in absurdly huge doses. The government should therefore employ people and have them build anything, even pyramids if necessary. This way, the government would inject money into the economy on a larger scale. And this solution works, right? It must be the case, since everyone says that Keynes solved the 1929 crisis problem. Well, it's easy to see that it didn't work. In fact, even with all the big projects like the Hoover Dam and hundreds of others, the economy kept drifting until the end of the next decade. It wasn't until the beginning of World War II that the economy came out of the miserable 1929 crisis. What? But my school textbook told me that it was Keynes who solved everything. Capitalism is dead. The free market caused the 1929 crisis. Hey buddy, spare me from these status economists. Let's see what really happened in 1929. A few years before, in 1919, World War I had ended. Thousands of American veterans came back to the US, and at the same time, European countries were in a serious economic crisis. All of this led to various crises in the following years. There was one in 1919, another one in 1920-21, and shortly after, one in 1923-24. President Coolidge initiated a big credit expansion using the American Central Bank in order to solve this problem. This expansion happened due to regulations imposed to the fractional reserve banking system. The fractional reserve is a system that allows banks to lend money that is deposited within themselves. This was widely restricted until then, but then ended up becoming legal. I'll give you an example. If I deposit $10 into the bank, you go to the same bank and ask for $10 as well. The bank will lend you my $10 and put it into your bank account. The thing is, I can take my $10 back from the bank at any moment, and you can take yours at any time too. And therefore, the bank has multiplied our money. We now have $20, even though in reality, there are only $10 there. If both of us tried to withdraw our $10 at the same time, the bank would go bankrupt. In practice, banks don't go bankrupt because there are thousands of people depositing and borrowing money at the same time. The probability of everyone trying to withdraw their money simultaneously is pretty low. But if everyone decided to go to the bank and wipe their accounts clean, the bank would be in serious trouble. At the end of the day, the result from this measure is a huge stimulation of the economy by the government. This created the economic boom of the 1920s. In the beginning, that was great for the economy. As of that point, the banks had incentives to lend money at low interest rates, and people got the opportunity to buy things with easy credit. Companies invested more and everything was fine. But there is a detail in this equation. People's personal buying preferences had remained the same. After some time, after people had bought what they wanted, they began to lower their rhythm of consumption. Instead of buying more, people began to invest their money. And this brings up to the second part of the cycle. Since investments in stocks are the most common form of investing, stock prices got higher. This means that companies started having more money to invest in procedures and products, but people weren't buying that much anymore because they were investing. Anyone could have looked at stock prices and company revenues and concluded that they were dealing with an economic bubble. One thing simply did not correspond to the other. When this happens in a single company that is being misjudged, it simply goes bankrupt. The employees get fired and the investors lose money. This is where things should end. There would still be other companies employing people and other stocks that can give revenues. The market would regulate itself. Crises only happen when there are external factors, such as a war or a long drought. Those external factors could affect many companies and lead a number of them towards bankruptcy. However, the market would still eventually heal itself. On the other hand, whenever there is state intervention in the game, with money being injected into the economy, this affects every aspect of the market. The very means of business is affected. Government intervention and credit expansion were the cause of the 1929 crisis and of many other crises that we experience nowadays. Keynes' underconsumption theory is indeed incapable of explaining the crisis. Although his this theory might have a reasonable deductive basis, it doesn't take adjustments of the market into account, and it also doesn't explain why every company reached a production surplus at the same time in 29. It simply does not make sense. If Keynes' explanation of the issue is already bad, his proposed solution is even worse, because even if the crisis were caused by an external factor, like a war or a climatic problem, the market has mechanisms to heal itself. If there are no state interventions, the market can recover quite quickly, but of course not painlessly. Sure, some companies would go bankrupt along the way, but that's just how it is. Whenever the government helps some companies while claiming that it's trying to solve a problem in the system, what it's actually doing is helping some of its close friends that would otherwise face problems during the crisis. If those companies were to go bankrupt, people would get fired, but the economy would heal itself and relocate those people somewhere else. On the contrary, whenever the government tries to help its friends, all that it's doing is giving more of the same poison to the patient that had gotten sick in the first place. It's just like giving alcohol to an alcoholic in the middle of an abstinence crisis. Yes, it alleviates suffering in the short term, but the problem won't be solved. It will be way better to let that patient go through the cold turkey, which is the only possible cure. In summary, small crises are inevitable anyways. They happen with or without the government's intervention due to factors that are external to the market. Without the government's intervention, credit expansion, and all the other insanely harmful measures, crises would be smaller and wouldn't last as long as they do in this day and age. The free market tends to adapt faster with minimal losses in general terms. Don't forget that the side effect of injecting money into the economy is inflation. Money does not have value in and of itself, but rather it merely represents a quantity of labor or goods. So much so that you can exchange money for products and services. Even if money is pulled out of the government's ass, the amount of wealth in the market doesn't change at all. Whenever money is created, there are simply more units of colored paper to represent the same stuff as before, causing money to lose its value. But don't you worry, the government's buddies won't be harmed by this at all. They're going to receive more money anyways. Even if this money has a lower value, they should be able to make a profit, so that's pretty okay for them. This will only harm the average citizen, who isn't a friend of the government, just like you. You'll remain with that same amount of money, just having that money be worth less than before. This is called an inflationary tax. The effect is exactly that of a new tax. In the end, you'll have less money than what you began with. Happily enough, in a few years, our money supply will consist exclusively of cryptocurrencies. I still don't get why people trust state currencies like the dollar, the euro, and so on. All of those problems will be left behind. There will still be economic crisis, but they will be quicker since there won't be any parasites getting in the way of the market. And finally, I want to make something very clear. Of course, our society would be better off without a government, but I didn't choose anarcho-capitalism because it's better for society. I am an anarcho-capitalist because it's the only social structure that is totally ethical. Any other structure uses unjustified violence and coercion against innocent people. Even if the state were necessary and capable of dealing with crisis, it would still be something bad that shouldn't exist. Fortunately enough, the ethical side is also the best option economically speaking, so you don't really have to make a choice. There is only one right way. Welcome to ancap.su. Thanks for watching. This article was suggested and written by Furtado, revised and narrated by Ancap.su. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it in your social networks. If you want to be notified of other videos, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon below. See you next time.